I'm going to be concentrating on the Italian speakers, on Victorian's Goldfield. I'll mention a few others, but the area I know the best is around that Dalesford earlier, the Jim Crow Goldfield. The Italians were non-English speakers. They were called foreigners or aliens back in the day, basically meaning they weren't British subjects. So they had a few obstacles to overcome because of that. So we'll look at that. I'll skirt around a number of issues, such as who they were, why they came to the Victorian Goldfields, some settlement patterns, what made our Swiss and Italians or Italian speakers different, and what cultural heritage they left behind. So I'm going to start with some maps. And our first one, we have Italy with Switzerland up the top. And you'll see in the middle one, Ticino, or the Italian-speaking part of Switzerland, is right there. So it really pokes right down into northern Italy. And over on the right-hand side is the Italian-speaking canton of Switzerland. And there's also Areto Romanche, I can never say it, speaking area of Grisons, which is there. There's also some settlers from there, like the Pedrettis, which is part of my family as well. I'm always interested when I look at the northern Italians, the Lombardians in particular, how much mineral water there is. And when I went to, my Gervasonis come from a town called Bergamo in Lombardia, and they are from a little town outside called Sangolo in the Brema Valley. To get there, you go past San Pellegrino, where all the mineral water comes from, about 2 or 3 towns up. So they knew about mineral water, and they end up in Hepburn Springs, basically. Switzerland's really interesting, 4 different languages, small country. So this shows where the different languages are basically spoken, but if you've been over there, they speak them all, generally. But down the bottom, in the little dotty part, you have Ticino, Poschiavo in the Grison is where some of our people came to as well. Interestingly, when I was over there last time, I went from Frankfurt by train through Bellinzona into Ticino, and I wanted to go to Brusio in just past Poschiavo, and it was easier to go into Italy and around than over the Alps. So the country's so different over there, and what we might take for granted, a straight track, sometimes you really have to rethink. I also wanted to point out, to work out where they are, the French speaking, which looks like it's around here, because Governor Latrobe's wife, Sophie, was from Neuchâtel in that French-speaking part of Switzerland, and during Latrobe's reign, really, they encouraged vine dressers from there to come to Australia, and that's really the start of the winemaking industry. So we have De Castella at Yering and Titaz and a few of those names at Geelong. So there's Swiss and Italians certainly got into winemaking, and a lot of their vines came from Geelong. So we should acknowledge other aspects of Switzerland as well. Then to the Victorian Goldfields. I assume everyone here is basically up with Victoria. We don't have any internationals, do we? But we have the map here, so that's the sort of area most of the people I'm talking about came from. But it's interesting to look at the route to the Goldfields. I think this one's 1852, And in 1852, you really had to go up to Ballarat and around to get into Jim Crow, or maybe come right round there. A bit later there would have been some cut-throughs, but it was a really hard place to get to. And there was little written about it in comparison to other places because it was hard to get to. So, but that's an interesting aspect as well. It was a bit hidden there, and some of the people writing up about mining, for example, were saying they think this much gold has come out, but they don't speak Italian, so they don't know. This is some work that Dorothy Wickham did in I think it was for her PhD, and she looked at the differences between British and foreign birthplaces. So you can see there's a lot more from British places in Victoria at the time. Not so many from a foreign place, enough to show on the graph. But out of all the foreigners, the Goldfields had the most. So they were certainly leaving their country for some reason to find gold. It works out that in 1854, Ballarat had about 17,000 British subjects and just over 1,500 foreigners. So that's roughly 1 in 8 foreigners. Interestingly, Sandhurst or Bendigo works out to be about 1 in 5. So there's a lot more British than foreigners on the Goldfields. But there certainly were enough, say, in the Dalesford area, for 10% of the population to be speaking Italian. Here's a few stats in terms of numbers of foreigners. And we'll see in 1881, we've got close to 1,000 Italians, but we don't have any... Oh yes, we have Swiss. We have 1,314 Swiss. So they're pretty big numbers in comparison, other than China. The people on the screen, we've got some German, some Swiss, Chinese, and that's furniture made by the Gervasonis in the early days. I probably should be checking my notes of what I wanted to tell you. In this one, I wanted to put up some naturalisation stats. You'll see that there are only 31 Italians over 6 years. Well, I know going through the National Archives that there were more than 31. But if you look at other European countries, there's 294. Until 1861, there was no unified Italy. So they probably were saying Lombardia or Veneto or wherever. So they're probably coming up under other European countries. But if you were a foreigner, you weren't allowed to own land until 1863. So if you wanted to farm or build a house other than on a miner's right, you needed to be naturalised to own land. So that's one difference that the foreigners or non-English speakers had. That changed under the Duffy Land Selection Act in 1863, and aliens were given the right to purchase land in the same manner as British subjects. To become naturalised, you had to go to a magistrate and take an oath. You had to pay £1, which is about the price of a miner's right back in the day. Quite a lot in those days. You often had to hire a lawyer and a translator. It was often more than £1 to do that. And here we've got Carboni, had to put him in. So many of the foreigners that came over had been involved with the revolutions that started with 1848 in Europe. In northern Italy in particular, a lot were involved with the Italian Wars of Independence, and there were the 3 Wars of Independence. Garibaldi was the person that led a lot of those. The other person on here is Joseph Barbarus, who was a spectator of the Eureka Stockade. So both of these people were in this location in 1854. He was born at Genoa, Savoy. So rather than Italy, he was born in Savoy, the Kingdom of Savoy or Savoia. His father was a parliamentary secretary. We presume in the Savoy Parliament in Turin. Many people, particularly researchers that are wanting to prove a point in terms of a contention in academia, may mention that the Swiss Italians were peasants, and yes, there certainly were farmers and people that did not have a lot and weren't overly well educated. But there was an astounding number of really well-educated people that came out to Australia. According to Barbarus's obituary, he was educated at Genoa, but trade made him familiar with English, French, Italian and Spanish languages. He would have been highly sought after on the goldfields as a translator, especially in that later part of 1854. The Italian speakers didn't leave their politics behind them. They were great community members, and they later, once they were more au fait with English, they served on many local councils and boards committees. Oops, wrong way. With Eureka, there's quite some interesting language about foreigners that comes up particularly on the reward posters and other posters around about the time. The day after Eureka, Charles Hotham said, "The insurgents are principally foreigners, were well drilled and said to be well commanded." So were they thinking that they'd been in the Garibaldian Wars? If we look at the numbers of people in and around the stockade, how many of them were Italian speakers? Maybe 1 in 8. So I find it really interesting that the foreigners often get some blame in terms of Eureka. This is another one for social order, and they talk about all true subjects of the Queen, all British subjects, and also all strangers who have received hospitality and protection under the flag. Every time I read posters like this, I think of how many different ways the different segments of the community back then could have received this, depending on their experience and their viewpoint. What if you hadn't received hospitality or protection under the flag like the Chinese? What if you weren't a true subject of the Queen like the Irish? What were you, a stranger who had not equal rights extended to them? I also wonder how a translator such as Barbarus or Carboni may have been translating this poster for other people. Why did they leave their homeland? Do the people with Swiss and Italian ancestry know why their people left? I don't either. I think it's mainly gold, but most of my people left before Italy became unified, so they were leaving from an area. Lombardy was under the control of the Austrians at the time. The Austrians were greatly hated. They imposed large taxes. They were conscripting people into the army so that they were Lombardians and others in the armies on foreign countries fighting. There was a lot of seasonal work between the border of Switzerland, Ticino and Italy. The Ticinese, the Swiss, were quite sympathetic to the cause of those that were under the control of the Austrians. So the Austrians shut the border and they could not do their seasonal work. There happened to be some failures of crops. At the time, there was a lot of unemployment. There were a lot of smaller properties, so, as families, often there were big families to work the land. How do you split that up into a number of people so that your farmland becomes smaller and smaller? The Kingdom of Sardinia was involved with the Crimean War. Gold had been discovered in America, California in particular, and Australia, and some countrymen had had success, and that was getting back. And Swiss shipping companies were giving incentives to the Italian speakers to travel to Australia for our settlement, meaning that they got a passage that they had to pay back once they had success. I'm sure there were much better terms than that, but generally that's what happened. So things were pretty crook over there. There was the chance of saving the family through finding gold. My contention is that's the main reason they came. Why did they congregate together? Some of the earliest successful Italian-speaking gold seekers were around the Daylesford area. So, word of mouth, go to where you know of someone, they speak your language. It's the same as whenever we have settlements in. Congregate together, help each other out through that language barrier and the other aspects that make it hard when you're first settling into a new country. Both these names, Van Zettes and Skages, are still around in Hepburn Springs. So I love Chummy Jim, he's got a lovely smile, and the Van Zettes ran a bakery in Hepburn for decades. But here they are, you can see they've really been working at destroying the countryside, seeking gold. The next one is one of the Richard Daintree photographs, and it's hill mining under lava on the Jim Crow diggings, Daylesford, around 1861. So a lot of the Swiss, the Ticinese, were stonemasons. Very handy when you come out to Australia looking for gold and you have a basalt layer. So the Italian speakers were really known for tunnelling under the basalt layer. If you look, where did I put my little thing? I know it's really hard to see, but if you go into the website, you see it much better. Around here there's holes. That's where they're going in and tunnelling under the basalt. Not sure where this is, but to me, if you know the area around Hepburn, it looks like what locally is known as Manning's Hill, on the way to the footy ground at Hepburn. This one is a Swiss tunnel at Jim Crow diggings, this time around 1858. I reckon they're taken on the same day, but it's around about the right time. In this one, I have a bit of a laugh because you've got your guy up here doing the work, maybe they are, and you've got your three standing around making sure the work's done. But of course, back in the day, you had to stand still for your photograph because the exposure was for so long, so I do forgive them. But this has got everything. It's got your bark huts, it's got sluices and water races, and wrong one, the opening to the tunnel. In the newspapers there's a lot about tunnelling, and they say the Italians know how to do this and basically other people didn't attempt it. So some people did really, really well. A lot didn't do as well as others. Under Dalesford there was a huge tunnel called the Long Tunnel, and that was Potsy and Fumberger, both Swiss, and they did very, very well. This guy is one of my favourites, Vincenzo Perini, and he served on the inaugural Mineral Water Committee. So back in 1864, the mineral water was being disrupted by mining, and a committee got together and decided that mineral water was more important than gold, and this is one of that committee. He ended up, well, he ran the Revival Hotel to begin with, but eventually his house, Locarno, the town he came from in Switzerland, became a guest house, and he was highly involved with Hepburn Springs, and the best spring at Hepburn Locarno is named after his guest house. But he did start as a miner, and the mining accidents and the inquests are really fantastic ways to find your Italian speaker, because they're often not in the official records. And one of his mates, Battista Rasconi, died in a mine that Perini was involved with on the Jim Crow diggings, and he gave a witness statement. He said, "I'm a miner and reside at Sailors Creek. The deceased is a mate of mine. On Monday last, about 10 o'clock, we were at work. Deceased was at work. He was about 150 feet into the drive." It's giving us really great details. "I was outside when another mate came out and said that a quantity of stuff had fallen on deceased. I went in and found that it was so. The body was quite covered with earth, and taken out there was no life in it. I intended to have put a timber at the place, but had been working at the same place. When the body was taken out, the nose, mouth and ears were bleeding. He must have fallen on the handle of the pick, for it was broken and pressing on his belly." Perini also had a son called Franklin, who served during the Boer War. So a lot of the first generation Australian born from the Swiss-Italian migration served during World War One, but Franklin Perini served during the Boer War. And when Franklin came home, there was, a party for him. And expressing his gladness to have his son home, he said, to have such a son to fight for his adopted country and for the British Empire, I'm so proud. So moving to Australia, to become Australians, really, by that stage. There was quite a bit of difference. Sometimes it was dress, sometimes it was food, sometimes wine rather than gin. There's also some differences in naming patterns that can confuse people looking for our Swiss and Italian or any foreigners. So on the goldfields, whatever people wore in their homeland, they often wore on the goldfields, because there weren't as many shops and there wasn't as much disposable income to keep buying clothes. Jan Venek, the Dutch, he wore red trousers, and that was in one of the writings it said all Dutch wore red trousers. Some of the Italians wore red shirts, as in Garibaldi and his red shirt army. So with the picture of the Garibaldians there, that's maybe what some of the shirts looked like when they were here. The other photo is from the Swiss and Italian Association in Dalesford area, and there's a little card with a whole lot of these photos on it, and you'll see that they have the Swiss cross on their hand, fantastic hats with feathers. They weren't afraid to show their Swiss and Italian fashions. During the 1860s, when the Land Selection Acts were in, there was a special clause called novel enterprises, and that was targeting the foreigners to do things like grow tobacco, to grow vines, all those things that maybe the English didn't know. So the novel enterprises, if you go to the Public Record Office Victoria, there's a listing of everyone that got additional land under the novel enterprises. With the naming conventions, sometimes you can find your, better see how my time's going, sometimes you can find your Swiss and Italian people by knowing that the first son was named after the paternal grandfather, second after the maternal grandfather, third after the father, same on the female side. But also, when they sign their name, they often put their surname first and their other name second. I've got an example of that later on. Eventually, a lot of them discovered that they were going to find more success by forgetting the gold and farming and getting supplies for the goldfields. So once they could get their land under the Land Selection Acts, they did start farming. They did start factories and things to produce food. So we have the Gervasonis cleaning out the barrels, the wine barrels. They had quite a vineyard at Yandoit Creek and did export wine to Ireland. Below is laying out the pasture at the macaroni factory. And the Lucchini family. The macaroni factory started in 1852, so it's the first site of Italian, macaroni pasta making in Australia. The receipt is from the Gervasoni collection, and you can see in 1905 they're buying a case of macaroni, a case of vermicelli and some olive oil from the Lucchinis. The great thing about the macaroni factory is the ceiling has been painted by Pietro Lucchini. So the brothers were Pietro and Giacomo. There's designs of Intra on Lake Maggiore, where they came from. But interestingly, one of the bedrooms has a scene from Verdi's Il Trovatore, and that opera was on at La Scala the same year they came to Australia for the first time. So on their way, they've obviously dropped into La Scala to view the opera. Bull boar sausage. Anyone not tried a bull boar sausage? You must. Newstead Butchery has great bull boar. A lot of the butchers in Daylesford, if you can find a family that still makes them, they're the absolute best. This is Gary Thomas. He runs Spade to Blade in Daylesford. He's a descendant of the Morganti family and has done a lot of work into bull boar. He's gone back over trying to find out if the Swiss and Italians were making bull boar sausage in Australia to European recipes or whether it's Australian. A bull boar is a strongly flavoured sausage with wine, garlic and spice. It has pretty well equal parts beef and pork, and each family had their own secret recipe, different parts. You know, they might have a bit more pork or a bit more beef or more wine. The Gervasonis had more wine than anyone else, apparently. The way they minced it, apparently you could cut a bull boar sausage and you'd be able to tell who had made it by the look of it. So there's still quite a lot of recipes around, but a number of families have lost them. There's still a lot of good-natured boasting, but Gary did put it to the test during the Swiss Italian Festa, and the Gervasoni recipe did win the most popular. But the Sartori recipe was a foodie's dream, apparently. So the intricacies of the flavour balance was quite incredible. So different people look for different things. But Gary will still make some bulbul. You have to be a butcher to sell them, so you can only do it for yourself. But here he is. He did go overseas and discover that really the beef was not in the Swiss or the Italian sausages. It was quite an Australian thing. So they called it a rich sausage, or a rich man's sausage, because of all the beef in it. It has been listed on Slow Food's Ark of Taste as one of 2 listed Australian foods. So the other one's the macadamia. It's quite a rigmarole to get on this list. So the bulbul sausage is an Australian food, but with the Swiss Italian tradition. Gary and I are going to get together and do a book on bulbul with his foodie aspects, my historical background, and if you have a recipe, I'd love to talk to you. But they are yummy. This is the Morganti property. It's on Eastern Hill, on the outskirts of Dalesford. The coloured one was taken about 8 years ago. There is a spring that comes up in the cellar. They've built their house under the cellar. So you can see down here the creek flowing out of it. Very handy. This is the treason trials. So you can see 1, 2, 3, I think there were 4 out of those tried for treason during the Eureka treason trials were foreigners. One of them there, number 2, was Charles Raffaello. Obviously, he'd written his name or told his name as Carboni Raffaello. They haven't coped, they've got his name down as Charles Raffaello. If you're looking for your non-English speakers, you've got to think like that. How would an English speaker interpret the name? Another naturalisation. Is there anything interesting? I think I've mentioned most of the things about the naturalisation, but after the opening up of the land, and you didn't need to be naturalised, the next time the Italian speakers started to become naturalised was around the time of Federation, when they were getting older and there was talk of a pension. So they were smart. It's interesting that names like Baraki, Catani and Kekchi, who were all very important government workers, weren't naturalised early on, so they could work for the government. I'm going to roll through a few pictures that show some of the people and some of the things that they've left, particularly the buildings. So this one is Releri. There he is up the top and his family down the bottom. But he took over the Palmer House, which was built by Fabrizio Crippa in 1864, and it was run both as a hotel but also a guest house, and it was greatly loved. He also had some troubles. He unfortunately had a bit of an accident with his gun and shot his best mate. But he didn't have enough English to say what he'd done. So apparently he was quite upset and his hands were moving around, and an English speaker came over and he said during the court case, he made me understand. So he didn't have the words, but he obviously had an acting skill, or, you know, said what had happened. By the time he got to the court, he had an interpreter. But I really love that, you know, he made me understand. The interpreter was really, really important, and a lot of the courts around Daylesford had a paid interpreter. A lot of them didn't, and they were complaining that the Chinese had an interpreter, so we should have one as well. Another case, often, you can imagine the Italian speakers with their hands going everywhere and trying to say what had happened in a court. The magistrate bore the infliction with exemplary patience for a long time and threatened to commit a disorderly speaker. After a while, the verdict was given for the complainant after the reporter said, "A long investigation and a confusion of tongues." So this is what our ancestors were experiencing. These are some Gervasonis. So the bottom house down here was the one that was on Restoration Australia, if you've seen that show. And that was built by a partnership of 4 people, 2 brothers, Carlo and Luigi Gervasoni, Fabrizio Invernizzi and Giuseppe Giapponi. Eventually, they all separated out as they partnered up and married and got into other dry stone houses around the Andort Creek area. So Luigi ended up in Bergamo House, and I think that's my great-grandfather there, and my great-great-grandfather, and that's Eliza. She was Australian-born, German descent. So we lost the language in that generation. They had to speak English. Oh, sorry, there they are there in the middle. But there were quite a few brothers that came out, and this letter was by Giuseppe Gervasoni, who returned to Italy. It was by Biaggi, you can see at the top, Melbourne to C.A. Biaggi Guildford. He was the interpreter for the Gervasoni family. He was also the honorary consul for Italy. Giuseppe's going home. He wants to transfer his land to Luigi, so I'll be obliged doing whatever you need to do to transfer my land. I've sold my interest to Luigi Gervasoni. At the top, obliged by your acting for me and doing whatever may be necessary in my name. They had to trust, because they didn't have those languages. But with the Gervasoni family, that the Italian consul really tracked their people. So by the time they appointed a paid consul, he used to travel around and check them out. And when he went to the Gervasoni property, he said something along the lines of, at the end of the day, when they all sit around the table, you would think they were in their homeland. So doing everything on the Australian land, but obviously eating Italian food, having the big Italian conversation. Probably don't need much more. This one is the Righetti farm, Helvetia, which was a really huge dairy. Why I include this one, and I've got a recent photo of it here, is the stables. Notice that they're built into the side of the hill, and inside there's huge flagstones. So they've obviously assumed that they need to house their animals in winter, which we don't need to do. But this barn shows that they were transferring their knowledge of their homeland to Australia and needing to change it as things went along. But you can see it's quite a big area. This property and the Gervasoni property are both registered by Heritage Victoria, as is Palmer House that the Roleris had, and the macaroni factory. Here's Palmer House again. It was built by Fabrizio Crippa, who was a butcher to begin with. And then by 1864, he had enough money to build this grand villa. And he put a vineyard in. He dug up the rows where the vines were to go. He got all the bones from the butchery. He put them down, blood and bone, and then planted his vines. Some vines didn't work. It was a different country, different conditions. So rather than waste the year or two that he had, he cut them off and, is it called layered? When you put grafted, thank you, different varieties on. And he won a prize, I think, at the International Exhibition for Wine. In 1864, when this was built, it was written up in the newspaper and basically saying the Sons of the Sunny South have made a beautiful building on the main road in Hepburn. Down the road a bit, so across the road from the macaroni factory, is the Savoya Hotel. In amongst that front, there used to be, remains of the weatherboard building. It has just sold and there is some work being done, but you can still see the roof lines. This is really an important site for the Italian-speaking community because in it they had, in 1864, an Italian reading room, so you could borrow books in Italian, and that's where the Mineral Springs Committee met. So when they decided that mineral water was more important than gold, and from that committee they petitioned the government and the first Mineral Springs Reserve was put aside at Hepburn. There is a great write-up in the paper. Same shot as the Roleris before, but it was done up absolutely spectacularly. So you'll see in the bottom part here, they actually scraped every bit of paint off the wall and then put a sienna line around. It was a guest house. It's now part of Pepper's, and they have put bathrooms and things in, but the entrance hall down the bottom is the same, and it is a spectacular building. In 1906, there was a disastrous bushfire that burnt out Hepburn Springs. If you go over that way, you'll see Dalesford's a Victorian town, and Hepburn Springs is an Edwardian town, and it's because of the bushfires. And basically everything was burnt out except for the macaroni factory, Villa Palmer, Savoya, part of Vanzetta's bakery, absolutely decimated. 2 people died, 2 Italian speakers, and it was all over the newspapers. There was a big response and people did donate money to assist, and about 20 houses were built for those deserving. And these are 4 of the houses. So Lawrence Tonetti's family, Peter Tamagna, Michael Yanna. The Yannas are still in Hepburn Springs, and I think every generation of the Hepburn Fire Brigade has a Yanna as the captain, and Dora Tamagna. And I love her little house. I don't know what she does in there. Might be a room for a bed, but interesting history. Over at Guildford, the Italians started basically on the side of the Hepburn football ground, and from there they started spreading out. So a lot of the tunnelling around there at Breakneck Gorge, to Dalesford, to Eganstown, to Guildford, to Yandoit, to Newstead, a bit later to Walhalla, slightly different migration, some of them. By the 1920s we have some Italians coming into Carlton. Eventually around the 1870s, from that migration that centred at Hepburn to Kalgoorlie, Coolgardie, Greytown in New Zealand, so they did start spreading out everywhere. They were great at running pubs, and the Delmenicos certainly ran their pub at Guildford for a long time. This is the Guildford Family Hotel, as it was in the 1970s, I think. Didn't write that down. They were from Navajo in Ticino. In Ticino. The bearded gentleman here is Giovanni Brzezowski, and the family below is the family of Australian-born family of the Invernizis. Both Invernizzi and Brzezowski married sisters. Unfortunately, the Invernizzi parents died and left their children orphans. So the younger ones went and lived with Giovanni Brzezowski at Ginac, near Clunes. The older girls went back home, and there are letters going backwards and forwards, but Invernizzi was one of those partners with the Gervasonis building the big house, and Luigi Gervasoni ends up being a, I always get the name, a guardian, along with Brzezowski, of the Invernizzi children. So they did look after each other. This is the Swiss Mountain Hotel, out on the road towards Dalesford, and run for a long time by the Lafranquis, the Swiss Lafranquis. Down the road a bit is St Joseph's Church. It's recently sold, so it's private property now, but that was built by 3 Swiss stonemasons, Gaetone Tomasetti and Andrea and Celestino Lafranchi. Tomasetti from Avegno and Lafranchi's from Collio. So there's quite an impact in that area. Here's my Swiss and Italian Association blokes, and I've gone too long. You'll see that they have their armband on. They met, they raised funds for things like the Dalesford Hospital, they had ceremonies, but one of the favourite things that I found was the talk of it was a newspaper report when Dr. Guschetti died, who was quite an amazing man in his own right. They obviously had their little armbands, and if you're a member of the Swiss and Italian Association, you got to wear it at the funeral. And D. Righetti writes to the newspaper, "Out of respect and patriotism, I attended the funeral of the late Dr. Guschetti, though I did not see the propriety of wearing the national colour, but if it were a requisite in order to show the deceased nationality, to which I do not object, the colour should have been strictly confined to Dr. Guschetti's compatriots. The distinction was not observed, for a good many who were not Swiss wore the Swiss colours, while many Swiss could not obtain any, the badges having been wrongly appropriated by others who were not entitled to do so. Thus, those who had contributed were disappointed." Through food and culture, wine, they were really moving into the general community, and I think that really shows it, that it wasn't the Swiss that were wearing it. Everyone wanted to wear the band for Dr. Guschetti. You'll be pleased to know I'm almost at the end. I thought I'd better put in a Ballarat one in, so these are the Delicas. Hopefully a few people know John Delica, one of my favourites in town. But they had, Domenico Delica was Swiss. He married an English girl. A lot of the Italian speakers were Catholic and married Irish for that reason, but he didn't. Although they did marry at St. Alypius, but he was a wood splitter, and look what he ran: firewood, coal, charcoal. So obviously a wood splitter and selling things out. Main Road this was on. Swiss Italian Festa, the community celebrates the Swiss Italian and Italian speaking migration to the area. There's of the schools, all the schools tend to learn Italian, and there's street parades and all sorts of things. There's a bocce competition it's meant to be for descendants, but often it's not. And this is the trophy, the second one there. It's got the names of the Italian-speaking families, or the ones that used to speak Italian. But there's about 3 there that say blow-ins. So there's been some other people, and they're the blow-ins. And my last slide, a challenge. These are 4 Swiss Italian people that came to Australia, and they have famous descendants today. Anyone know any of them? Can you see any resemblances? No. But he's not there. But yes, he is. He was from Neuchâtel, so French speaking, but we'll have him. Look at the eyes of this one. He came out with the Italian opera company that toured around, and the person that is descended from this person called Ercole Filippini is Paul Kelly. This one is, I haven't got his first name in, surname Skepsi, Fred Skepsi. Over there is the Releri. So Anna Burke, who was Speaker of the House, is descended from the Releris. And the last one, have another go, not Di Castella, Monaghetti. So it was a very brief look over. There's so many more stories, there's so much more to say, but there's not enough time. But hopefully you either found out a bit more than what you knew, or had what you already knew corroborated. So we'll finish there.